That person's running late, so we can start whenever you're ready.
Okay.
Yeah?
Ready.
Just have to get Rachita's disclosure language here.
For what?
Rachita's disclaimer language she always wants at the beginning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the press conference for the global campaign to demand climate justice. My name is Victor Minotti. I am the constituency co-focal point for DCJ in the ENGO space, that's the environmental NGOs. And we all voluntarily declare we have no ties to fossil fuel or high emissions industries or any Zionist entities. And this is about the global North blockers in the post-Trump pullout. As we all know, the United States, when President Trump began his second term, pulled out of the Paris Agreement for the second time. But yet we see they have, despite their formal absence here, the U.S. presence is very much felt. And yet we see other developed countries stepping forward to lead efforts and defending the interest of those countries that got rich first by burning fossil fuels. While we see ex-officials still roaming the halls and huddling in the rooms, we've seen the UK and the EU become lead blockers of climate justice, obstructing political space to advance climate finance and the Glasgow goal for doubling adaptation finance specifically. We see them posing as phase-out champions while claiming their budgets are busted. We know this puts them in a difficult position, yet they come here and continue to claim climate leadership in Belém. So I'll introduce our panelists here. One of them is running late, will be joining us momentarily. But as just again to set the table a little bit more, we see many ex-officials from the US. Of course, when President Trump came in his second term, they all lost their jobs at the State Department, but yet we see the former heads of delegation, the former special climate envoys, the former legal advisors, and particular negotiators on specific negotiating tracks, out here having coffee, huddling with the umbrella group this morning, and they're in the rooms and very present. Of course, the presence of the US is still very much felt. When we were in Bonn this June for the intersessional meetings, President Trump had convened NATO members in The Hague and got them to increase their military spending from 2% to 5% annual GDP spending. And of course, this is on top of all the new trade deals that the Trump administration has gotten, Europe, Japan, South Korea, many in Southeast Asia, to buy more US fossil fuels, to actually commit to concrete purchasing contracts, volumes, as well as investing directly into the US fossil fuel infrastructure. So the countries that are supposed to be leading the transition are in fact digging a deeper hole and throwing their money into it as well, while they come here and claim that their budgets are busted. Of course, we know it is the case. In the UK, it's like there's a budget crisis. In Paris, there isn't a budget. Germany is spending to rearm, and yet so all of that is really set the table for a disappointing finance discussion where we see the developed countries blocking. I know it might sound like a never-ending story, but looking back at Paris Plus 10, this is the year, or at least the COP, where countries are soberly celebrating the 10 years and what's been achieved. Of course, some things have been achieved, but overall we know we're losing the war. And many of us said this in Paris, that it was a deal designed to fail, not to implement the climate convention, which says the purpose of the convention is to avoid catastrophic climate change. And the Paris Agreement actually doesn't really make that possible because of the bottom-up, nationally determined contribution system where countries just do what they want and not what really science or equity demands. But there's still the rule-based system that is very important to defend and to keep in place, with the equity provisions, with common but differentiated responsibilities, because developed countries, the ones who created the problem, committed themselves to leading the transition and to financing the transition for developing countries, as well as adaptation, as well as loss and damage. So the world is waiting for them to deliver on these commitments. In the Mutirao discussion we see right now, that's actually, in my view, a sign of where Paris has been falling short and failing. Not only the NDC shortfall, which we know doesn't add up to enough, to the 1.5, but also in the Article 9.1, the provision of finance, global north countries failing to actually provide the public grants that we need. And then, of course, the unilateral trade measures. So these are all things that are agreed in the Paris Agreement, and yet 10 years later, we're still pushing for them to be enacted. So you'll hear more about these details from some of my colleagues, and I'll just turn to my left on the far end there to Mariana Paoli from Christian Aid.
Thank you and good morning. Finance, as we know, is really essential to move forward with climate action and across to deliver all tracks of the negotiations. I think to some extent we are still witnessing the hangover from Baku when the climate goal established that proved to be completely insufficient, inappropriate to deal with the needs of developing countries. To some extent, finance in this COP is the elephant in the room, and especially the provision of public finance. The NCQG left more questions than answers. And more problematic, what we have seen is a promotion of a number of false solutions based on private finance and private sector first approaches, when we know that private finance is problematic, it's insufficient and limited for mitigation, it often neglects adaptation, and is completely inadequate for loss and damage. So when we look across the tracks on the negotiations here is a profuse, clear refusal of developed countries in providing that public finance so much needed. It's present within when discussing the adaptation finance. We cannot have, for example, just the indicators, and the indicators right at the moment are not looking good without discussing the finance for adaptation. We cannot have a just transition mechanism if we cannot secure the finance that will enable that just transition. And first and foremost, as Victor was mentioning, we have a very concrete proposal from developed countries in terms of having a way forward on Article 9.1. The Mutirão text is very clear and explicit on the proposal of a 3-year work plan on this one. And why that would be so important? Because we need to focus on the different elements of the provision. So how, who will deliver what? So, grants and highly concessional finance for adaptation, for loss and damage, in how this is going to be accounted for, how can we establish yearly targets from now until 2035 when the NTNC-KG completes. How can we really explore those sources to be equitable and particularly also making the connection with external sources, for example, advancing progress on environmental taxation, making polluters pay, wealth taxes, etc., which means how can we really advance the principles of CBDR? Also very important, how can we connect that conversation with these enablers of climate action, debt, the cost of capital, and how can we secure a finance for developing countries which is not really worsening their debt burden. Transparency and accountability is essential to be moved forward. How can we define climate finance? How can we ensure that commercial loans, for example, are excluded from that definition? So as counted as climate finance. So it's really important at this point in time for us to measure the success of this COP in terms of finance on what and how developed countries, the UK, the EU, Australia, Japan, and a number of others, on how they're going to address that and stop blocking. We are seeing them blocking the finance tracks of negotiation throughout. If this COP fails and fails on finance, it is developed countries to be blamed. And we shouldn't really get confused here on this. And lastly, we know that the best instruments where this finance should be delivered is through the UN funds. We have the Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, the newly created Loss and Damage Fund. If they're really serious about it, they need to channel the provision of finance through this. And the first test for the NCQG is on the Article 16, which talks about tripling the provision of some of these funds by 2030. The amounts are not nearly what is really needed, but this is a first test. So this is how we're going to be judging developed countries on a litmus test on what they deliver here on their finance needs.
Thank you, Mariana. Let's bring it down to Brandon Wu from ActionAid US.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks, Mariana. I actually want to start by playing off of something you said, Mariana, which is that finance is the elephant in the room at this COP. I've been to about 15 COPs at this point, so almost half of them. And finance is the elephant in the room in pretty much every single COP I can remember. You know, if anyone is surprised by the fact that the global north is not providing finance and that's causing problems in these negotiations, you either haven't been here or you haven't been paying attention. You know, on finance, it's really clear. On delivering money to the global south, the global north has failed, is failing, and is planning to fail, right? So not only have they not delivered money, not only are they not coming forward with new pledges, they're giving every indication in these negotiating rooms that they're just not planning on ever doing so, right? All we hear over the last decades at this point are excuses. And they come in here talking about wanting to defend multilateralism, from my government, for example. I'm from the United States. But multilateralism is under threat in part because for it to work, all parties have to put something on the table. Everybody has to contribute something and do their fair share. And on finance, certainly the signal that was sent, particularly last year at COP29 in the finance decision there, is that hardly any new money is going to be forthcoming. And what money is going to be forthcoming is going to be fake. Let's just call it fake. It's going to be loans, commercial loans, right? Maybe some concessional loans, but mostly commercial. That's what most climate finance loans are. They're at market rate. It's going to be private finance, which is probably means investment in multinational corporations or global north companies. So what they're really talking about is opening markets for their own companies, right? Subsidizing their own companies to do business in the global south. That's not climate finance. That is not cooperative action that enables multilateralism. So please, let's look beyond what they're saying when they say we need to defend multilateralism. What they're really doing is pointing a finger at themselves. I wanted to introduce, a number of our organizations released a report this year. We've been doing this every year, evaluating country pledges for climate action. Which is something that really should be done by the countries themselves or by the UN, but again, they don't like to have fingers pointed at themselves. So what our analysis shows is that over the past 10 years since the Paris Agreement, we're not talking about pledges to the agreement at this point, we're talking about actual action. Global North countries have fallen pathetically short. There's an 88 gigaton gap between what they've actually done and what our analysis of their fair share of emissions reductions would be. To simplify that a little bit, basically almost every global north country should be at or near zero emissions at this point, 10 years after the Paris Agreement. None of them are anywhere close. right? And climate finance is also a key part of their fair share, because the global south actually on aggregate is doing their fair share of emissions reductions, but unfortunately that's not enough at this point. Inaction from the global north has created a historical moment where essentially all countries have to get as close to zero emissions as possible. And so global south countries have to go well beyond their fair share. That has to be financed by the global north. And expecting anything else is unjust and frankly unrealistic. It will not happen without finance from the global north. So without finance, there is no ambition. Everybody in these halls, I think, understands that. But the global north negotiators are playing dumb. They're pretending to just not understand that. We had an EU negotiator in a presidency consultation saying, why are we talking about finance everywhere where we're talking about ambition? They know the answer to that. They're playing dumb. They don't want to provide the finance. But deep down, they know that they are at the heart of the problem. They're at the heart of why this process has not delivered the ambition that it's supposed to, and why multilateralism is under threat, because we're not seeing tangible outcomes. And it's because of the global north and their inaction. Last point, I want to talk about the US momentarily. Victor brought it up. They're not formally here, but the legacy of their intransigence is very much at play. I would note that just last month, the US killed passage of a levy on shipping emissions at the International Maritime Organization. The US was not there, but they were threatening countries with punitive tariffs, with visa revocations, right? They were using all the tools in their toolbox to stop this from happening, right? So they may not be here formally, but you can bet that they're doing things under the table. And if other countries in the global north want to protect multilateralism, they have to stand up to US bullying, and they have to chart a different path forward, a path forward that's actually cooperative and that has a different vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. It looks like our last speaker is still caught in a meeting, and maybe he'll show up, but I know that at least some of the things that, is there an update? On his way. Okay, thank you. Any idea how close? We'll keep the mic on for him. In the meantime, I would also just like to pick up a point about what Brandon was getting to with this, the fair shares and the equityreview.org report you can find there, equityreview.org. You know, in the Mutirao decision, right, we've seen the draft. It wants to deal with creating a space for providing finance and the failure to implement that finance. What are we going to do about it? The unilateral measures, a promise in the commitment in the Paris Agreement not to use unilateral trade measures for climate purposes because they harm developing countries and actually detract from the financial resources they need to implement their NDCs, implement their adaptation plans. And then lastly, the NDC synthesis report, which we saw had a huge shortfall. The question of how are countries going to respond to this shortfall is some of the biggest questions coming out of COP30. But just want to be clear that our proposal, what civil society, I think both DCJ, CAN, Tungos, the trade union NGOs, and I think almost all of the environmental NGOs are united in calling for this fair shares framing as the way to deal with that gap, that shortfall in the NDCs. It's not going to be enough for countries just to do what they feel like doing. We need those countries who got rich first by burning fossil fuels to do their fair share. That includes also the historical emissions. We've seen in the draft Mutirao decision no mention of historical responsibility, although it was repeatedly brought up by developing countries in all the inputs to government. Civil society brings it up as well, but we don't see it on the table there, or at least in the text. And so we're wondering, where is that part of the discussion? We know Brazil is trying to pull together, a balanced thing that's going to get everybody to sign on, but we don't want to go back into the trap that we've been for the past 10 years, where we see developing countries are just not doing what needs to be done to actually fulfill the convention, which is to avoid catastrophic climate change. As you heard Brandon say, developing countries are, it turns out, doing their own fair share, somehow getting it done without the finance coming from the North. But now we're in a position where, to make up for those countries that haven't been doing their fair share, the rich countries, they need to do more, and they need the financing to do more. So fair shares is really the framing that we want to see. The way this could work is many different countries, several parties already have their own proposed methodologies for how countries could calculate or quantify their emissions and their contribution of their NDCs. Almost every country right now complains that their NDC is 1.5 degrees aligned. But how do you do that if you've got huge historical emissions and you're not making the contributions that you need to get other countries to also contribute to their emissions? So, for instance, the US just looked at what the IPCC was saying for global emission reductions, right? It was by 2035, it had to be 60%. So the US said, okay, 2035, we'll pledge to do 60%. But the US has much more emissions than other countries because of the US history as being a top polluter since 1850. And just to throw out the figures, North America, 4% of the global population, has 24% of the global emissions since 1850. So compare that to South Asia, right? India, Pakistan, 25% of the global population has only 4% of the global emissions. So you see the unequal basis that a few countries have outsized emissions footprints, while some of the most populated countries in the world have really undersized emissions footprints. You ask, what about China? Well, China still, it is currently the largest annual producer. Since they were brought into the WTO in 2000, they quickly became the biggest annual emitter. But going back to those historical emissions since 1850, the US still has twice the emissions, the total cumulative historical emissions that China has. And of course, China has 4 times the population of the US. So how countries are going to contribute fairly to the global effort towards 1.5 has to address both their historical emissions, their current emissions, and for those who have a climate debt, so to speak, they have to contribute with the finance and the technology to help developing countries make a dent in that global picture. We've got about 6 minutes left. Maybe Assad will show up and maybe not, but let's open it up for folks to pose questions, please. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself. Folks from the media first, please.
Hi, Molly Lempria from Carbon Brief. You touched briefly on trade measures, and I wonder if you had any response to Wopke Hoekstra from the EU the other day saying that CBAM isn't really a unilateral trade measure, it's just part of their toolkit, and that as it's a national policy, they're kind of allowed to do it to ensure that there's no emissions leakage outside the EU, and how you would respond to, parties and countries pushing for those what they deem national policies at the potential expense of developing countries.
I'm sorry, because of the audio, I didn't hear you so well. But I think you're asking about CBAM, but I didn't get the details of it. Could we talk afterwards? And I'll be able to hear. Thanks. Is it Argus? Also up here in the front, and then if we have a moment for Assad.
Hi, Lucas Parolin from Argus Media. The transition away from fossil fuels has become a focal point at this COP. And I've heard some people say that it's actually a diversion from what should be at the table, which is financing. I want to hear your opinion of it. And I'm going to take the liberty and ask a second question. You mentioned Australia a lot, and Australia, of course, has a bid to host next year's COP. I want to know if their blocking of negotiations undermines their bid in any sort of way. Thank you.
The proposed transition away from fossil fuels, at least the text that we've seen, you're right, it doesn't, there are some new proposals to include some language on equity in CBDR, but it's going to be difficult for developing countries to accept this when they see provision of finance, even creating a space to deal with those issues being blocked, as we just explained, by the countries who are proposing the transition away from fossil fuels. And as I mentioned, those same countries are themselves still expanding fossil fuels. So we don't want to see them get away with another Dubai here. Assad, we could quickly turn to you for a couple minutes. We have 3 left, and I need 1 for closing.
Okay. Is it on?
Should be on.
Yeah. Apologies, I was in.
G has not changed.
Pull the mic closer. Pull his mic closer.
Closer to the mic.
On today, we must speak listening.
Okay. Sorry, thank you, and apologies, I was meeting with the Secretary General and all ran over. First of all, of course, it's an honour to be here in Belem, lungs of the planet, and a reminder both of nature's generosity and our collective responsibility to protect it. But I'm just going to speak as Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and we, of course, arrived here not with science ringing alarm bells, with the lived experience of communities, whether in Pakistan, Kenya, the Caribbean, and of course also in the UK, where we're facing floods and fires and hunger and displacement. Climate change, as we know, is no longer a story of tomorrow, it's the reality of today. And when we think about it, it's been 30 years since the COP and 10 years since Paris. One thing hasn't changed across all of those, and that is the wealthiest nations, most responsible for this crisis, have consistently failed to match words with action. And today, I've got to speak very, very plainly. The UK has now stepped into the role once held by the US as the chief blocker of climate justice. Friends of the Earth, England, Wales, Northern Ireland have taken the previous UK government to court twice. Why? Because it failed to produce credible plans to meet its own legal climate targets. So communities, whether they're in Hull in the UK or in Kingston in Jamaica and across, don't need climate slogans. What they need is climate action, rooted in fairness, in planning, in investment, and of course, a just transition. And it's at this point in this COP when we're presented with a real chance to advance that justice through the Just Transition Work Programme. The UK, despite clear calls from civil society, not only globally, but from the UK, from trade unions, as well as countries representing 4/5 of the world, still refuses to support the Belem Action Mechanism, a mechanism designed to help both workers, communities and governments plan a real transition away from fossil fuels. This is not a technical disagreement. It is a refusal to put fairness at the heart of transition, a refusal to stand with workers, and it is stepping into the seat vacated by the US. I am going to finish. The UK speaks loudly here about phasing out fossil fuels. But that phasing out fossil fuels is only possible if we have a Just Transition Work Programme, if we have a Belem Action Mechanism. That is the means in which countries and communities are able to transition away from fossil fuels and to ensure that we can build communities with the resilience where everybody has the right to live with dignity and in harmony with our planet. That's the work that we need. We need more. We need here solidarity. We need a recognition we are at a crossroads. And I will stop because I'm running over. Thank you.
Thanks, Assad. Please join us tomorrow for our press conference on just transition and another of our members on carbon markets, TFFF, and false solutions. And there is no climate justice without Palestinian liberation. Thank you. We'll take questions outside.
Sorry. I asked them where it was when I came back. They said, oh. They sent me in totally the wrong direction. I've ran twice along the whole of this.